Buenos dias, pendejos. It is Frank, Sunday, January 4th, 10:32 a.m. And we're going to talk a little bit about Donald Trump's briefing for the press corps that occurred yesterday regarding Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela and what it will be the disposition of the state going forward. So basically, the pitch should have been stabilization, not nation building, and the legal reality. Uh, the president was obviously up late. He had a little bit of a frog in his throat and left a couple things, I think, a little bit hazy, but just hazy enough that the idiots at the press corps will go on about it. So we are going to give you some legal strategic breakdown of what we feel, knowing Trump and the people with him, they're a bit of a student of the game. And anything that was done in Afghanistan and Iraq will not be done here. Picture more of a Marshall Plan style stabilization. So that could actually work here. While the president's language was deliberate, and when there were real legal pressure points, actually, most of which the media is barely touching on because they're worried about the regime change issue, which is funny considering all the people Obama overthrew. But then we're not going to talk about that. It's Donald Trump's time to shine, and he is advancing probably something similar to this, I would guess. We'll find out. But before that, we go into that. The one thing I forgot to mention on in this list, and most people are wondering about, is why in the world would he take Nicolas Maduro to New York to have him arraigned when the New York Circuit Court hates anything to do with the Republicans and especially Donald Trump? The reasoning is that is where the warrants and everything come from. This comes from the New York office. This has been going on before Trump, you know? So people seem to forget that Maduro has had a history with a number of our presidents. It's just one decided to act on it. So that's why he's in New York instead of Miami. And theoretically, the penalties are stiffer in New York for the drug trafficking stuff. However, the people of New York are going to have to deal with their new mayor's concept of what is considered the First Amendment for people standing in the street throwing fire bombs at the federal building trying to release Nicolas Maduro. That being said, let's get into some of the things that are going to be coming up. Trump's "we're running another country" thing and why it's a straw man. So he says running Venezuela because he's Donald Trump and he talks like that. Trump's phrasing was intentionally blunt, but he normally is. But legally, the United States does not need to run Venezuela in a sovereign sense to control outcomes on the ground. And that is a distinction that you're not going to see too much because he doesn't explain and the media won't even touch it. The viable model here is not occupation as government. It's something far narrower and far more effective, which is external stabilization, conditional reconstruction, and economic trusteeship, which they asked who's going to be running things. Okay. That's not a theory, it's a historical model. Okay. Like I said, it's better known as the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program, and has nothing to do with Iraq. It has nothing to do with Afghanistan. That's all you're going to hear about are those. And honestly, people shouldn't be bringing those up because there's probably a lot of indictments that could be brought down on the things that occurred vis-a-vis finances of the Iraqi and Afghanistan nation building that we have had to let lie. So here's the difference between this. Nation building, as you would see under Obama and the Bushes, tries to rewrite the Constitution, tries to come up with elections. It's foisting democracy on people that are not familiar with it. And they're trying to socially engineer outcomes on a clock. The Marshall Plan model focuses on security, capital injection, industrial restart, and keeping local administrative structures intact. Okay. And you see, you already talked about that type of thing where the oil companies are going to come back and things like that. And we'll talk about why it's so important that he stresses this, not so much that it's a war for oil that everybody discusses. One tries to manufacture legitimacy, which was the Obama and Bush era nation building, and the other one allows legitimacy to reemerge, which would be anything before Chavez. So, um, why when the thing that came up was they said who would be involved, and he said, well, these guys around me. So he pretty much named Sec Def and Sec War, and why that matters legally, because the next thing that you're going to have from Congress is challenges on this whole issue. When Trump explicitly referenced both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War slash Defense, that wasn't rhetorical filler. It signaled a dual track authority structure, and legally, that's far safer. On the defense side, the legal footing is familiar. Commander in Chief has authority under Article 2. AUMF, adjacent justifications tied to counter narcotics, maritime interdiction, and protection of U.S. personnel and assets. And critically, the ability to operate under status of forces agreements negotiated with interim Venezuelan authorities. Meaning, if there is a problem under this new regime, then somebody may get a bomb on them. All right. The key point here is simple. Defense does not need to govern. It's a bad idea when you let the Department of Defense run things, let alone a country. It only needs to secure, deter, and enable to allow this country to come back to what it was pre-communism. We're not reinventing the wheel. It was a thriving country prior to Chavez and Maduro. That distinction allows us to avoid triggering occupational law under the Hague and Geneva frameworks. On the State Department side, the authority is different, but just as important. State Department controls recognition, who the U.S. considers the legitimate authority. It supports interim administrations through technical ministries, financial controls, diplomatic normalization, and sanctions sequencing via OFAC licensing. The funny thing, if you recall, was the Minister of Defense, after they had snatched Maduro, said, "We are going to fight on." And a day later, if you saw the old wanted poster from Maduro, he is right below him at about 10 to 15 million dollars to get your hands on him. So somehow or another, he must have had two and two together, and they put the vice president in charge. But once again, she had been appointed by him. So there's going to be some type of ruling body until they can get it together over there, because it most assuredly is not going to be another communist. That result from all this, the result is a Venezuelan faced government with U.S. controlled economic levers. Legally, that looks far more like a trusteeship than an occupation. Okay. The locals are not optional. They are the legal firewall for this project. This is the part that gets ignored most often. Local participation isn't just optics. Can't be like you had in Kandahar, right? It's the legal keystone. For this to remain lawful, Venezuelans must hold ministerial positions. They must sign reconstruction agreements. They must request or formally consent to U.S. assistance. And yes, it does hold up because it was done in Germany after World War II. So if somebody wanted to see a country that was occupied, one would really be hard pressed to find Germany not on the list of a country that looked like it was being occupied. So meanwhile, U.S. officials get to be involved in advising, they condition funding, and control access to capital and security without assuming sovereign roles. We are not going to turn this into a Ukraine. Money goes in, money doesn't come out. Okay. That structure blunts the sovereignty challenges that we're talking about. It reduces insurgent legitimacy and keeps the U.S. out of colonial legal traps. So, those of you who remember Bosnia in the late 1990s, Bosnia, not Baghdad in 2004. And you're going to have to, we have to worry about the question of insurgency, not so much from the Venezuelans, but we do have a bunch of Cubans that have not been rounded up, Chinese that have not been rounded up, Iranians that have not been rounded up, and a few odds and ends Russians. So, who better to be there to whip up a frenzy, especially among the dedicated loyalists who have probably been involved in the murder and sex crimes and things of that nature that we know have occurred there over the last few years? Okay. Now, oil companies returning was the other big thing, and why that is a structural necessity and not just a crude statement. When Trump mentioned oil, it wasn't war for oil, we killed them all, right? It was structural reality. Venezuela's oil sector is technically degraded. It's contractually corrupted and locked under the sanctions that we have put on them over the years. Restarting it is going to require new production sharing agreements, arbitration resets, and OFAC carve-outs. You have to remember they nationalized a lot of oil property that major oil companies were involved in, turned it over to pretty much their cousin, and turned it all into shit. Oil facilities take a good amount of maintenance, regardless of what that landman show is telling you. It's probably came out the worst possible time because some of these congressmen are going to be watching Landman and thinking Venezuela is the same thing without the Mexicans. Not how it works, okay? Oil companies don't return because of the speeches. They will return when property rights are stabilized, when the security is credible, and when the time horizons are long. All right. Nobody wants to go and put $1 billion into something and have them nationalize it again. Nobody falls for that trick. That's why Trump talked about time and money and not a quick win, and it's going to take a while. And that's the important thing. This aligns with a capital first stabilization model. Look it up. Jobs before politics, infrastructure before ideology. The question about the troops, all right, and the importance of not saying no or when. And this is very important, and it's what killed administrations in the past and what also did, starting, I'd say, in Vietnam and working its way forward. But that was kind of designed for failure, and we all know that, especially war on terror. One of the most underreported signals in Trump's remarks was what he didn't say. They were saying we're going to invade or whatever. He didn't say no troops, and he didn't give a timeline for what was going on there. Both of those mistakes, as I said, have been made before. Saying no troops is just you're asking for trouble. You're inviting challengers. Saying we'll leave by X date gives the insurgents a reason, first of all, to launch an insurgency, Taliban, everybody else you've known, and knowing that we're going to be out. If we're going to be out of there in a year, all they have to do is lay back to the last month and then just start kicking our asses, right? So we'd have no baseline from which to judge anything successful or unsuccessful. So there is no, we're going to leave by a certain date. We are not putting troops out of the way as far as they're off the table. I'm sorry. We will use whatever force is necessary on these people, not them in general, but the bad guys, to make this thing work. Like I said, strategic ambiguity does something very specific, and that's why you have to have it. It deters without provoking them. It preserves flexibility without commitment. The U.S. learned this lesson the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan, where withdrawal timelines were in the newspaper and on television. They were propaganda milestones. Even the Taliban knew when to attack, right? So Trump's phrasing preserves escalation dominance and keeps regional actors like Cuba, Iran, and other proxies guessing. China, the Mexicans. There's a lot of people in there, although I'd say Cuba to some extent because they realize their days are numbered, but the Iranians for sure, and probably China. And they'll be guessing about what happens to them next. And now, where the real legal fight will actually happen, I don't think you're going to see what the media thinks it's going to be. There are some other things, and this won't primarily hinge on debates over occupation or colonialism or slogans about running the country from the United States. The real pressure points are going to be a bit quieter. And some people with some smarts are already sniffing around the edges. Congressional war powers challenges, sanctions sequencing through OFAC. Look it up, OFAC. International arbitration claims, recognition disputes over who speaks for Venezuela, and duration without a formal treaty framework. The reason I bring these up that the news will not bring up, it is the underlying international, whoever you want to call them, who needed to keep Maduro in that job, now will work frenzied to try to free him, to put him back in charge. So it's going to be six of one, half dozen of the other. Do they dare to fight us while we make their country better on the off chance that that shitbag gets out of jail and comes back to rule the place? You know, that's the fantasy world that some of these people are in, but it's also the fantasy world that the socialists and I'll say the Chinese need to have happen. Okay. None of these things are fatal if Venezuelans are visibly in charge. If the U.S. presence is framed as enabling rather than ruling, and if economic recovery precedes political experimentation. We are not there, and we are not going to allow the same bullshit that sidetracked everything else. We are not going to let the governor, the senator from California say that we will not agree to this unless you put an LGBTQ something somewhere. No. That was the one that they used to use in the Middle East, which was a killer. I don't know if all of you are aware of that. That was one of the ways if you wanted to kill a Middle East deal, the Democrats would throw something in there about that, which would immediately kill it because it goes against even the most moderate Islamic. All right. And that would kill the deals. Same kind of shit could go on here. I'm just using that as an example. I'm sure there are other things like hunting down Cuban intelligence and this and that and the other thing in the country, which we'll surely get around to. So, and the bottom line of that is where we're going to be looking is what Trump has outlined, even though it was blunt and short, is not an empire. It's not Iraq Redux. It's a sequencing doctrine, like I said, similar to Marshall, security, capital second, politics last, no clocks, no utopian promises. If you remember when they were was the German issue when they'd gotten on patent for allowing guys that worked at the power plant or the water plant or wherever bureaucracy who were possibly Nazis to continue to work. He says, well, you know, who's going to run the electric? And that's the problem, as you recall, happened before. Not everybody is guilty of everything. Some people, and especially in communist countries, will say, because can't say anything good or bad about that other thing. Uh, you get in the party to get along, to get up the food chain, so to speak. Okay, so we're going to have some bad guys. We're going to have a lot of bad guys from another country that we need somebody to finger so that we can get a hold of them too and have them prosecuted. But they're all mixed up in the drugs anyway, so it's not going to be a big deal. But if they were able to follow through with this Marshall style, then whatever government structure that they have there, if it's parliamentarian or whatever, it'll be some version of something the West goes for, then yes, everything will work out well. If they allow themselves to get stuck in this legal war, which is going to occur with Maduro, supposedly, which I don't think, if we didn't get a chance to do the video because it was, we put the written one up at 8 o'clock in the morning on the day of the attack, which was that because of the way you have to go on the website to see it, www.southfloridaconservative.com. Our hypothesis had been, and that was earlier than anything was brought up, was that somehow or another Maduro had negotiated this because he's not stupid. He's worth more to us alive than dead. And we can use all that political blackmail now on our Chinese buddies and our Iranian buddies and the Mexican government, all of which have part and parcel to the criminal operations that have occurred in that country. He is the one you want to keep alive. So we just have to worry that it is not Epstein him, and we'll all be dancing in the streets. So that's about all. Sorry, went a little long, but that's how this business is. So January 4th, Sunday, have a good day, and we'll talk to you later on. Goodbye.